And so, as we just discussed, cells require energy in order to make molecules. And so, cells are constantly using energy for their metabolism. And unfortunately, cells can't store a lot of this energy as heat because it would damage them, right? And so, as we talked about before, proteins, as in particular enzymes, can't withstand high heat and high temperature because they'll denature. And so, high heat or a lot of heat stored in a cell would not only damage cell membranes and proteins, but it would also damage the enzymes. Right? And so there needs to be sort of a safe way to store energy within cells and then release it when it's needed. And that is where the energy molecule or the energy currency of the cells, ATP, comes in. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. The adenosine can be seen here. It consists of an adenine, which is the same adenine or A nucleotide found in DNA, as well as ribose, which is a sugar. So this ribose plus adenine is adenosine. And then the triphosphate or 3-phosphate groups can be seen here. And you can see each one of them in yellow. And phosphate groups are extremely negative. And so trying to hold on to 3 phosphates that are super negative and therefore repelling each other is difficult. And it means that there's a lot of energy stored in these bonds between the phosphate groups. And that energy is where most of the energy in your cells is stored and released from in order to do work. And so, as I said, a lot of energy is stored in the bonds between the phosphate groups. In particular, this final bond here, which you can see between the 2nd and 3rd phosphate in red. And when that bond is broken, energy gets released, and so does that phosphate group. And ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, becomes adenosine diphosphate and releases a ton of energy in the process. And that's great because you need that energy to do things. But then you're going to need to generate more ATP in order to have more energy. And so how do you do that? First, you have to eat. You need glucose or sugar in food in order to make ATP. And that glucose is broken down. And in the process, phosphate groups can be added back to ADP using the energy absorbed from food to regenerate ATP. And we're going to talk about the process by which this happens in most of your cells, which is called cellular respiration. And this is different from respiration that happens in your lungs. This is basically just an energy generating process that happens in the mitochondria of your cells, breaks down glucose or sugar in order to produce energy or ATP. And you can see this equation here for cellular respiration. And just to remind you how to read these chemical equations, you have the different elements as letters. So you have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen within this molecule. And then the small subscript numbers tell you how many atoms of each element are within that molecule. And so this glucose molecule here contains 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms. And when you add this glucose molecule to 6 molecules of oxygen gas, or O2, it produces ATP, and as well as 2 other byproducts, water, or H2O, and 6 molecules of CO2, or carbon dioxide. And because respiration uses oxygen to break down the glucose into CO2 and H2O, it's known as aerobic because it requires oxygen. And the energy, or the ATP, from this glucose molecule is extracted in a series of 3 steps, which we're going to discuss in more detail in the next couple slides. So the first step of cellular respiration is called glycolysis. And glycolysis tells you what it does in the name. Glyco for sugar and lysis for breaking down. Glycolysis is the process of breaking down one glucose molecule into 2 pyruvates. And so you can see this glucose molecule up here in gray, and the two ultimate outputs of glycolysis, or two pyruvate molecules, here. And what you'll notice is if you have this glucose molecule, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 gray carbon atoms, and each pyruvate has 1, 2, 3 carbons. So you start with 6 carbons as one piece in glucose, and you still have 6 carbons at the end of glycolysis. They're now just in 2, 3 carbon units called pyruvate. This process happens in the cytoplasm of the cells. It's not in an organelle, and it does not use oxygen. So it's considered an anaerobic process. And in order for glycolysis to happen, it needs an input of 2 ATP to break that first glucose down. You need to put in some energy to chop this glucose in half, which comes in the form of 2 ATP. But then, through these conversions, it actually, as a process, generates 4 ATP, 2 from this pyruvate molecule and 2 from this one. And so overall, glycolysis has a net gain of 2 ATP. Right, so it makes 4, but it uses 2 in the beginning. So 4 minus 2 is 2 net ATP. And what I'm going to ask you to know for the purposes of this class is the inputs and the outputs of each process. So the inputs of glycolysis are glucose, the outputs are pyruvate, and 2 ATP. Now that pyruvate is then transported from the cytosol to the mitochondria, where it can enter the next stage of cellular respiration, which is called the Krebs cycle. It's also sometimes known as the citric acid cycle or the TCA cycle. And what the Krebs cycle is a series of 8 steps, where this molecule is converted in a bunch of different ways and releases energy in the form of electrons. And so in order to enter the Krebs cycle, the pyruvate first needs to be converted into a molecule called acetyl-CoA, which you can see here. And acetyl-CoA is only a 1,2 carbon molecule. And so in that process of converting pyruvate, which is 3 carbons, to acetyl-CoA, which is 2 carbons, 1 CO2 molecule is generated, because one of the carbons needs to leave. And also, you can see this NAD plus being converted into NADH. And what NAD plus, as well as FAD, are electron carriers. And so they basically act as like sort of electron trucks that can be filled up with electrons and ultimately transport them to the next step of respiration, the electron transport chain. And when we think of electrons in terms of this cycle, really what we're talking about is hydrogens. And so this NAD plus molecule fills up with electrons or hydrogens. And then in the Krebs cycle, another 3 NADs become filled with electrons. And 1 molecule of FAD becomes filled with electrons as well. So basically, we're filling up these carriers with a ton of electrons. And we're releasing some CO2 in the process as well, which, if you remember, was one of the outputs or products of in that respiration equation. And so once again, we do make some ATP in this step of the cellular respiration as well, but really it's not a ton. So glycolysis, we made 2 ATP, and in the Krebs cycle, we make 2 ATP from 1 glucose molecule as well. But what's really important about the Krebs cycle is the generation of these electron carriers, or the filling up or reduction of these electron carriers with hydrogen atoms. Because we're going to need to take those electrons and put them into the next step of cellular respiration, which is the electron transport chain. And so the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle, is happening inside the mitochondria, and the electron transport chain is located within the inner mitochondrial membrane, or this membrane right here. And the electron transport chain is a series of proteins, which you can see in blue, that take the electrons from the electron carriers generated in the Krebs cycle, like NADH and FADH2, and basically take those electrons and pass them down the chain or down the line. And in the process of passing the electrons from one component to the next, they use some energy and they pump hydrogen ions out into this intermembrane space here. And so those NADH electron carriers drops off electrons. Those electrons push hydrogen ions across the membrane, and those electrons get passed from number 1 to number 2 to 3 to 4. And every step pushes more and more hydrogen ions out here. And the reason the electrons move so well is because there's oxygen at the end of the electron transport chain, where that aerobic part of respiration comes from. And that oxygen wants to pull those electrons towards it. It's called electronegative. It's good at attracting the electrons. And it sucks them from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 towards itself here at the end. And ultimately generates water, which is that other kind of product from the cellular respiration equation. So we got the CO2 from the Krebs cycle, and the water gets generated here at the end of the electron transport chain. And as I said, these electrons are helping to pump hydrogen ions across the membrane. And this is important for the next part, or the ATP generating part of the electron transport chain. Because what these hydrogen ions do is establish a gradient, or basically a high to low situation, where there are a lot of hydrogen ions out here on this side of the membrane, and not that many in here inside the matrix. And when things are off balance, they always want to equilibrate. Remember homeostasis from the first lectures. And so if there's a ton of hydrogen ions out here and not that many in here, they want to come in because they want an equal amount of hydrogens on either side of this membrane. And so those hydrogen ions will come in, and they'll come in through a specific molecule called ATP synthase. And what ATP synthase does is act sort of like a water wheel in a mill. And hydrogen ions will come into ATP synthase, and they will essentially spin ATP synthase, just like a water wheel will spin, and in that way generate ATP from ATP. Because they give ATP synthase provides that power to attach phosphate groups to ADP to make ATP. So kind of to summarize, you need NADH and the other electron carriers to drop their electrons off in the electron transport chain. Oxygen kind of sucks those electrons through the members of the electron transport chain and ultimately generates water, at the same time pumping hydrogen ions out here to establish a gradient. And then that gradient, or all of these hydrogen ions, want to come back inside. So they come back in through ATP synthase and power that spinning water wheel kind of situation and generate ATP. And this is where the most ATP comes from in the in the 3 steps of cellular respiration. Because the electron transport chain generates about 34 ATP for one glucose molecule. And so if you remember, the glycolysis makes about 2 ATP per glucose. The Krebs cycle makes 2 ATP per glucose. The electron transport chain makes 34 ATP for one glucose. And so this aerobic step of respiration is the one that actually generates the most energy. All right, and so just as a quick reminder, take a second, look at the answers, and tell me which step of cellular respiration makes the most ATP. Pause your video, take a second. All right, as we said, there is a discrepancy between the different steps, so they don't all make the same amount of ATP, so D is definitely out. Glycolysis and the Krebs cycle both make about 2 ATP. Both make 2 ATP. And the electron transport chain makes 34. And so this step 3, or the electron transport chain, is the step that makes the most ATP in cellular respiration.